Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport, the host of this show, as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today is our annual adoption tax credit show. So this one will be the adoption tax credit for 2022 taxes. As in past years, I am so pleased to welcome back our two experts, and these guys really are the experts when it comes to the adoption tax credit. They are Becky Wilmoth. She is an enrolled agent and adoption tax credit specialist with Bill's Tax Service. And thank you so much, Becky, for being back with us. We also have Josh Kroll. He is the Adoption Subsidy Resource Center Coordinator at the North American Council on Adoptable Children. And Josh, welcome back again. I feel like the gang is here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to jump right in. I do think that it probably helps if we actually start with the amount of because the credit changes every year based on cost of living, I think. So, Josh, what is the adoption tax credit for adoptions being claimed on the 2022 federal taxes?
The maximum amount is $14,890 for adoption when you're claiming the adoption tax credit in 2020.
Okay, and so am I correct that it is adjusted upwards based on cost of living? Is that what it adjusts to?
It is, and in fact, for 2023, because you may have some people who are in process, the amount will all go up over $1,000. It will be $15,950 for 2023.
Gotcha, but for this year, we're at $14,890.
Correct.
Gotcha, okay. So, Becky, let's talk about the difference. What is a tax credit, and how does that play out on your taxes?
A tax credit, the difference between a tax credit and a tax deduction lowers your taxable income. A tax credit actually helps cover your federal tax liability. That is what the IRS says that you would owe them, depending on, what the total amount of your taxable income is. So the difference between your tax liability and your withholding is what you get as a refund or owe every year. So basically what the adoption tax credit and a tax credit covers is before the tax amount ever gets to your withholding, that tax credit covers that tax liability. So that's why it is such a great credit and is so important, because it covers that federal tax liability.
So that means that you would get, if you have withholdings, would that potentially mean you would get a larger refund check every year, or you could have less? If you knew about it in advance, you could have less withheld out of your paycheck. Is that how that would work?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
All right, and we continue to get questions about refundability. And there was a brief and shining moment many years ago when the tax credit was refundable. And I don't want to spend too much time because it's not refundable now, but I do want to give us an opportunity, and Josh, I'll turn this question to you, for how we could advocate for refundability. Again, it is not a refundable tax credit now, and it hasn't been for many years, but we continue to advocate for it. So could you give our listeners where to go to help advocate for getting this to be refundable again?
Sure. There has been bills introduced year after year to make it refundable. With the new Congress coming in, it'll have to start all over again. But the best place to go is adoptiontaxcredit.org. NACAC, as well as many other adoption groups, are part of that website, and it's geared specifically towards advocating for it to be refundable.
Okay, thank you. So please, everybody, consider that, because it would be really great if we could get it refundable again. All right. So, Becky, what happens if you don't have federal tax liability? Should you, just give up on it? Should you still apply for the credit? But you don't have any liability, so do you get anything from it?
You should absolutely go ahead and take the adoption tax credit, even if you have zero tax liability, for two reasons. Number one, everybody's tax situation can change from year to year. But not only that, but if it does become refundable again, you will have that credit carry forward sitting there waiting. So even if, say, this year you have zero tax liability and someone tells you, oh, well, you don't need to take it, there's no use in you take it, go somewhere else, because you absolutely want to take it, because it's always easier to carry it forward, because you can carry it forward for up to 5 years. It is much easier to carry it forward than it is to go back and amend to take the adoption tax credit. So, absolutely, even if you have zero tax liability, go ahead and take it and then just carry it forward.
Okay, excellent. So, Josh, what type of adoptions are included or excluded?
The ones that are excluded really are adopting your spouse's child, so step-parent adoption, so adopting from foster care, private domestic, whether through an agency or an attorney, or adopting internationally are all eligible.
Okay.
But I know you're about to say, what about embryo adoptions? And I'm pretty sure the answer is still no on that one.
Yeah, I think it is still no on that one.
Yeah.
All right. What about same-sex partners doing a second parent adoption?
It all depends on being married. So if they're married, and this is the same for opposite sex couples, if they're married, it's a step parent adoption. If they're not married, then it's a second parent adoption, and the expenses would be allowable.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But then this is a case where not being married actually benefits you financially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then technically, I don't think anybody would want this headache, but technically, if you married in the same year, but it was after the adoption and the expenses, it should be legal, but it will probably raise flags with the IRS because,
Just because
it's in the same year. They're only looking,
Yeah.
the IRS looks at 365-day chunk.
Yeah.
So,
right. They're not going to,
They're not good at nuance.
We have received this question in the past, not this year, but would surrogacy be covered? And the answer is no, surrogacy is not covered. All right, so can you get the credit for each adoption you complete, even if it's completed in the same year? So let's say either you're adopting siblings or you just do two separate adoptions. Becky?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. And I've seen that happen. Of course, there's always a lot of sibling groups, but I have also seen families finalize separate adoptions in the same year, and absolutely, each successful adoption qualifies
for an additional credit.
Right.
Go ahead.
And I would just add to this, because there have been confusions. Not everybody reads the instructions. I know Becky does, but not all tax preparers do. If you have more than 4 kids adopted in a year, or even if they're strung out over multiple years with a carry forward, you fill out additional 8839s so that you can claim more than 3 children, because there's only spots on that form for 3 children.
And that is the form. He just 8839 is a form number. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That is very correct.
Yeah.
All right. So, Josh, what is a qualified adoption expense for purposes of the adoption tax credit for taxes in 2022? That's a general question. I
know. It's generally going to be expenses related to the process of adoption. The big ones are going to be, adoption fees, what you're paying an attorney or an agency, court costs, but also can include travel. If you're, adopting a child internationally or someplace else, and the travel isn't just flights, but also lodging while you're there, food while you're there. And for folks who are adopting maybe through the foster care system, it can also be like pre-placement visits. Sometimes they want you to visit the child and they might not be near you before you actually go and adopt the child. And I think that covers, most of it. Background checks, home study costs, I think that covers most of it, but Becky will know better. Usually she gets this question. So.
Becky, now you're up, okay?
Well,
anything else?
All of the above that Josh said, but really what the IRS says is anything directly necessary related to the adoption. And as far as travel, there is no mileage for adoption, but you can take gas receipts. And I always advise clients, start with the big seat receipts first,
Mm-hmm.
because most of the time you're going to have more than enough, but let's start with the big receipts, before we worry about all the little things. Let's go for the big ones first. So yes, any expense necessary and directly related to the adoption of that eligible child.
And every year we get questions about what about birth mother or birth parent expenses, just as the way of background differs. What is allowed to be paid differs significantly by state. It is a state law issue. But I think that what it's something, it should be something of a moot question, because it is not 100% clear how the IRS is going to be treated, but almost always you're going to have other expenses that will make up the amount of the credit. So it seems to me it's something of a moot point. Becky, would you agree? Start with the big ones and you're going to use up,
Right.
14,890 will not go that far.
Right. And the thing is, the reason that birth mother expenses are not allowed expenses is because it violates federal law, and some states allow the birth mother expenses. But as far as federal law, the reason it violates federal law is because you cannot deduct living and personal expenses according to the IRS. So those birth mother expenses, like you said, almost become a moot point, because by the time you had attorney's fees, court costs, all of these other expenses, so that's why I just tell clients, when you pay, that agency fee, just get an itemized detailed list,
Mm-hmm.
and that solves the whole thing.
Perfect. And let me pause. The actual correct term for these expenses are expectant parent expenses or expectant mother expenses. In the tax circles, we still hear it referred to as birth mother expenses. And these are just the expenses that, if your state allows it, some do, some do not, to help an expectant mom. It could be clothing, it could be housing, it could be transportation during her pregnancy prior to the adoption. Let me pause here for a moment to tell you about a free educational resource. Thanks to our partners, the Jockey Being Family Foundation, we have a library of free online courses for you, our listeners. You can find them at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. And you can see there are 12 of them up there. They are fantastic. If you need a certificate of completion, you can get it. You don't have to get it, but you can get it if you need it. They're there. They're great for foster parents, adoptive parents, or kinship parents. All right, so excellent. Now, the adoption tax credit works differently depending on the type of adoption. So we've got foster care adoption, we've got domestic adoption, we've got international adoption. So let's break those down. Josh, I'll start with you. Domestic private infant adoption or domestic private adoption in the United States. How does the adoption tax credit work for those adoptions?
For those adoptions, typically they won't be determined as special needs, which we'll go into more detail in the foster care adoption, although there are some cases where they can be. So they're going to be documenting expenses. The big difference between the private domestic and international, which also document expenses to be able to claim the credit, is timing. And the timing for private domestic adoptions is, and it doesn't actually have to be infant. I mean, not that there are many that are not infant, but there are some, is the timing issue. And if you're doing this and it's taking multiple years, you can claim the credit for expenses paid the year after you pay them if the adoption's not finalized. So if I started my process last year or 2 years ago in 2021, and I paid $3,000 in home study payments to an agency, And whether I've been matched with an expectant mother or not at this point, those $3,000 that I paid in qualified adoption expenses in 2021, I can take on my 2022 taxes, even if there isn't a child identified.
Now go ahead and contrast then that to international. That might be a better way to explain
Yeah.
it.
So with international, I'm still documenting expenses, but the timing issue is it's got to be finalized. You have some flexibility in when it's considered finalized. If it's finalized in country, the country you're adopting from, you can always claim it as that's the year of finality. But if you're in a state that requires you to readopt in the US, and Becky might know a little more about these, but you can also do it later, and that can come into play with income limits for families trying to maximize the benefit. But you can't, the international adoptions, you can't claim them until they're finalized. And it was really sad when Russia closed down suddenly all those years ago. There were families in 30, 40, 50,000 that never could recoup those costs that they had already paid out because they were never able to finalize their adoption.
Yeah. Becky, what about, Josh mentioned where when a state requires readoption of an international adoption, they go through the readoption process, a readoption in the United States, in that state. But what about when parents, there are many times where parents will choose, if only to get a U.S. birth certificate, which will make things easier, where they will choose to readopt. Can the expenses for a readoption, if it's not required by the state, can we use that as our timing?
Yes, you can. You have up to 2 years in order for an international adoption when you are either by choice or by state mandatory laws that you are required to readopt. You have up to 2 years. So the perk of that is, number one, because of the adoption tax credit increases every year, and like from 22 to 23, it jumped significantly. So if you have $30,000 in expenses and you're going either by choice or by the state law, you're going to readopt. I guess in my tax brain, it's kind of a no-brainer, because you have up to 2 years. And when you're talking such a big significant difference from 2021 was 14,440 and 2023 is 15,950, that's plenty incentive, to go ahead and use that 2-year time slot up that you have in order to readopt.
And we will talk about this in a minute, but there are income restrictions too. And in case you have an income fluctuation that might make a difference, that's another reason to consider if you have the option.
I will say one thing though, if you did do it in the earlier year and you did readopt, once you finalize the adoption, you could still get that extra if the expenses were paid in that later year.
The expenses, only the expenses you have incurred?
Yeah.
The readoption expenses, you could try to claim that. Okay, got it. Interesting. Okay, all right. So let's talk about kinship adoptions. We are certainly seeing, I don't know if we're seeing more of those, we're certainly encouraging families, and this is primarily children in foster care, or not in foster care, but where kin, grandparents, aunts, uncles adopt a child. If it's your grandchild that you're adopting, or if it's your niece you're adopting, Josh, are you eligible for the adoption tax credit?
Yep. The only limitation is it's not your spouse's child.
Gotcha. And that's again, whether or not your grandchild was ever in foster care or you just stepped in because you saw that there was a need, it doesn't matter at all. You're still eligible for the federal adoption tax credit.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, now let's talk not quickly, because this is not a quick topic. Becky, let's talk about foster care adoption. We've talked about domestic infant and international and the timing, and you're having to track your expenses. Does foster care differ from this?
It does. On a foster care adoption, of course, it has to be final, just as it is on international. The adoption must be final. And with a child in the foster care system, if they qualify for that subsidy agreement, they qualify for the full amount of the adoption tax credit with no expenses. And, subsidy agreements, there's different types of subsidy agreements. Some is the monthly stipend, some is just Medicaid, or the one-time reimbursement. If they have that subsidy agreement, for either of those, one of those three criteria, then they qualify for that full amount of that credit with no expenses. And, there's a lot of people that are told, well, I didn't have any expenses, so I don't qualify. That is not true at all. In the foster care system, if they have that subsidy agreement, and, 95% of the kids in foster care system, have that subsidy agreement. Some states are what I call more special needs friendly than others, because each state has a different criteria as to what qualifies as special needs. And the biggest issue with that, Dawn, is what you and I consider special needs and what the IRS considers special needs is two complete different things. What the IRS considers special needs is hard to place without some type of assistance agreement. That's what the IRS considers special needs. When in our mind, when we think special needs, it's, physical, some form of disability or possible implications down the road of some type of exposure the child has had. But the most important thing to remember is if they have one of those criteria for special needs with that subsidy agreement, they qualify for the full amount with no expenses.
I would just say, because I deal with adoption subsidy, that's actually the main part of my job. And what Becky said is 100% correct, but really it comes down to, do you get adoption assistance agreement, as Becky said, that provides one of those three criteria, then it's special needs for the purpose of the IRS. And this might be getting a little too much in the weeds, but anybody that's doing their own taxes, you don't mark the disabled, you mark the special needs on your taxes. The disabled is related to something else about adopting someone who's over 18.
That is correct.
Go through the three criteria again, just to make sure.
It'd be the monthly payment, Medicaid, or the reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses.
All right, Josh, what about the situation where, and this comes up not infrequently with infant adoption or very young children adoption. The child is adopted, there is no identified special need at that time. However, the parents are concerned that there may be, because this is an infant at this point, we don't know, the child may have been exposed prenatally to alcohol or drugs. We're not sure. So the parents ask for, it's called different things, and you are the expert on this, but $0 amount subsidy agreements is one thing. They'll probably go by other. Can you talk about how that would be handled? Because the parents, the social service agency is saying the child is perfectly healthy. There is not hard to place. But you as a parent say, but in the future, we don't know what's going to be coming down the pipe.
Right. So the states that offer that, it's not all states, but it's probably a majority of states, they call it future needs, high risk, dormant, deferred. Those are some of the common terms. Those, as long as they provide one of the categories, and the only state that I know that has an agreement like that but does not provide any of those three things is Georgia. But as long as it has one of those things, and Medicaid's the most common, the non-recurring is the other one. Those agreements typically come with zero monthly payment. Those are good enough for the IRS. And the reason states do that is also to make their life easier, and actually it's like a backstop. If problems arise later, it's a much easier process to get those families support.
Exactly.
So it's a good thing that the states do that, and then it has the added benefit of then qualifying them for the adoption tax credit of special needs.
And almost always, if you're getting a, whatever it's called, deferred future needs subsidy agreement, $0 amount, you're going to have Medicaid. And so Medicaid is one of the criteria. So this is a moot point again, or almost always. All right. So Becky, Many, in fact, not many, I would say all of the children being adopted, or the vast majority, let's say, being adopted internationally, do have some form of special needs. International adoption is basically a special needs adoption program now. So what about those kids? They have special needs, often significant special needs.
Well, and once again, that is where the difference between what the IRS considers special needs and what we consider special needs is two different things. So for international adoption, it is going to be for expenses, just simply because, yes, there are a lot of international adoptions that those children have disabilities or medical issues, whether they're realized now or later. But for international adoption, it is going to be for the expenses.
Gotcha. Okay. We get that question every year.
And then the reality is usually they're still going to be over the full amount. So
Right.
It's not going to make a difference because all the special needs does is let you top off at the amount. But it's actually Congress passes the law, and that for special needs, they do have to be a U.S. citizen or resident at the time of adoption.
Yeah. And that's, the point you made is that sometimes people will say, well, that's unfair. Well, fairness in the eyes of IRS is, it's not up to you or I to judge. But also the reality is international adoptions are going to be well over the tax credit limit. So,
but remember, it's Congress actually set the law.
Yes.
IRS administers.
That's true. Good point. Okay, so I should blame
very
Congress.
Clear on that. Yes.
Okay,
Exactly.
Okay, I will blame
Correct.
Congress. There you go. Okay. IRS, please. I do not want to irritate the IRS. That would not be a good idea. All right. So, Becky, can you reclaim your expenses for an attempted adoption that did not result in a placement, or resulted in a placement but the birth parents changed their mind?
For the only type of adoption that you can recoup failed expenses is for private domestic. And so it is the same way on a private domestic adoption as it is for a failed adoption. You cannot take those expenses that tax year. You have to wait until the following tax year. So let's say, for an example, I paid adoption expenses in 2021 and the adoption fell through. And so I could not take those on my 2021 tax return, but I can take them on my 2022 tax return that we are getting ready to do. And so what happens is when you claim that adoption tax credit for the failed attempt, what you receive in adoption tax credit for that failed attempt will come off of the next successful adoption that you have. So to keep the numbers clean, let's say, for an example, you had $5,000 in failed adoption expenses that you claim that you paid in 21, but you cannot claim them until your 2022 tax return. So you claim those $5,000 in a failed adoption. So then let's say the next following year you have a successful adoption. So you take that $5,000 off of that successful adoption amount, which will be, the $15,950. So you would only actually qualify for $10,950 because you have already received $5,000 from the previous failed adoption.
Got it. That makes sense. But let me just be clear that the adoption tax credit that people are filing for 2022 is the $14,890, not the $15,000.
Correct.
Yeah, you gave that number. I don't want to get people's hopes up. We're
Absolutely.
We're thankful for the 14,000. We'll be happier next year, but that's okay. We're okay. Where we are now. Did you know that most people find out about podcasts from their friends? So what we need for you to do is tell your friends about the creatingafamily.org podcast. That helps us reach more people with our mission of support and education. So please spread the word. Let your friends, let your family, let the guy sitting next to you on the subway or the barista at your local coffee place, let them all know about the creatingafamily.org podcast. All right, so I've talked about income limits, so let me go back to that now. Josh, regardless of how much money you make, are you eligible for the adoption tax credit, or are there income limits?
So when you claim the credit, it calculates your modified adjusted gross income. And it does start to phase out in 2022 at $223,411. Over the next 40,000, it's always a 40,000 range. So up to 263,410, you're going to get a partial. If your income is above 263,410, you're going to not get anything because you're over income. Okay. So this credit, when we're talking about Magi and what I was talking about timing with international and why people might want to pick one year or the other, this credit is only applied, this income test is only applied in the year you're claiming the credit. It's not applied if you have carry forward. Now, at this income level, if you're just under, if you're about 200,000 and you just have one kid, you're going to use it all up in 1 year. But if you adopted like a sibling group and you're near this level, you might have some carry forward. And the income limit does not matter for carry forward, just for claiming the credit.
Okay, got it. So you've mentioned carryover. In fact, we mentioned it a couple of times so far. When does it come up? I mean, we've said 5 years. You have 5 years with which to claim the credit. Give me an example, Josh, of how somebody wouldn't claim it and why they would need to carry it over.
So let's say I adopt one kid with adoption assistance special needs in 2022. Go file my taxes. I claim $14,890. My tax liability, I work in child welfare, so I don't make a ton of money. So I use, we'll say, $6,000 in adoption credit when I go and do my taxes. That increases my refund. I like that. That means I didn't use $8,890. That's the math. And that's going to carry forward, like Thanksgiving leftovers. That's going to carry forward to my 2023 taxes that I'm going to file in early 2024. And I keep doing that until I use it up, or a total of 6 years have passed. It's 5 additional years. So the year you claim the credit plus 5 additional years. And if you're private domestic and you're claiming the credit over the years because it's taking a while to adopt, each year you claim that credit, that year has 5 additional years. When I claim more the next year, that credit has 5 additional years. And the IRS makes you use the oldest credit first. I know it's getting a little in the weeds, but it does matter to some families.
Oh, yeah, for the actual amount. Am I oversimplifying it and saying where this really comes in primarily is for families who don't have much federal tax liability for whatever reason, income is low, or maybe they've got the way they've got their money invested for whatever reason, they don't have a large federal tax liability, or
they're adopting a larger sibling group.
Right, so they get exactly. So they get,
because if I adopt 4 kids next year, I'm looking at almost 64,000. That's
right.
a little harder to use in 1 year.
Yes, good. Yeah, very good point. Yeah, absolutely. All right, this is a question we got in, so I'm just going to read it, and Becky, I'll direct it to you. Are you able to amend previous year tax returns to claim the adoption tax credit? We originally misunderstood how it all worked, so we missed claiming the tax credit in 2019. Is the adoption tax credit something you could amend for? And if so, how many years can you go back, and how do you amend?
Absolutely. One thing to remember, especially when you're amending tax returns, you can only amend 3 years for a refund. However, since the adoption tax credit is a 5-year carry forward after the initial year of claiming, you can go back 5 years, carry those first 2 years forward. You're not going to get anything for them, okay? So the only reason you are amending is to carry those forward. However, when you get to that year 3, from there forward, you can claim, refund for that. So you can absolutely go back and amend for the adoption tax credit. And one thing that I want to clarify that what we were just talking about is, there's only three things that the adoption tax credit does not cover. It doesn't cover self-employment tax since it's non-refundable. It doesn't cover first-time homebuyer payback, and it does not cover the 10% penalty for early distribution of retirement. Now, there is a QBOD, is what we call it now, due to the Secure Act, and I think we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I just wanted to mention, when we're talking about federal tax liability, there's federal tax liability and self-employment tax are two different things. And that may be the reason that someone is not able to use the adoption tax credit or to the maximum amount that they could have if it was refundable. But since it's non-refundable, it doesn't cover that self-employment tax. So I just wanted to clarify that when we're talking about federal tax liability. But yes, absolutely. If you, or if you didn't know about the adoption tax credit, or if someone told you didn't qualify and you actually do qualify, absolutely go back and amend your tax returns. And one of the great things now is you can amend electronically. You could not do that for years. It had to go in paper. And we all know what it's been like the last 2 or 3 years has been an absolute nightmare for us as far as, paperwork with stuff going on and everybody shut down because of COVID. And it's created a firestorm. But since the adoption tax credit can be amended for, and you can amend electronically, absolutely, please go back and amend your returns.
Can you amend electronically the 2019 returns, or is that only 2020 or 2021? Is that
19?
all?
Yes.
19 you can too? Okay,
yes.
good. And just to clarify, right now 19 is still an open year because those taxes were due April 15th, 2020.
Correct.
And the 3 years is April 15th, 2023, which we have not hit yet. And if you do an extension, it's to that, whatever the day you filed, up to October 15th of 2023. If you filed early, you have to the due date. So even if you filed early, you filed in, February 1st, 2020 for your 2019 taxes, you still have till April 15th of 2023 to amend that and get that in to be able to get the refund for that year.
Okay, excellent. Which one of you wants to explain the Secure Act and how it applies to birth or
Becky.
adoption? Okay. Oh, yeah. This is in our family, we call it nose goes, where somebody touches their nobody, not me. Okay, so, all right, Becky, the gauntlet has been handed to you.
Well, there have been a lot of issues with this.
First of all, tell us what the Secure Act is.
Well, what the Secure Act has done as far as adoption and the child tax credit, the biggest issue that we have dealt with is because of Social Security numbers. It has become a firestorm. The main reason is with all of the stimuluses and with all of the changes in the child tax credit, that Social Security number has become the hot topic. So that's why if a lot of people want to take an A10, because with the stimuluses, a lot of things changed with the A10s and Social Security numbers. If you have to file an extension, this is what I'm going to say about the Secure Act. If say you've been waiting for a Social Security number.
This is for your child.
Correct.
Okay, so it's the issue is you don't have a Social Security number for the child and you're trying to get the credit.
Correct.
Got it.
So what you need to do is you need to file an extension, okay? And you need to wait on that Social Security number because of the Secure Act, in order to claim a lot of these credits, stimulus, child tax credit, all of these, you have to have the Social Security number by the due date of the return. So let's say let's say the adoption was final in 2022. Well, it comes time to do your 2022 tax return and you still don't have it by April the 18th. File an extension because you need that Social Security number in order to claim those credits.
Okay. All right. So that's the solution. File an extension, and hopefully with the expectation that you will continue to file extensions until you get the Social Security number.
And there's times that I've had to tell clients, if they've had issues, at one Social Security office, go to another one. And I know that sounds absolutely crazy. And it's the same way when you're calling, the IRS, because they've had so many agents retire, that they are still training many new agents. So a lot of times you may call 3 different times, get 3 different answers. So I highly recommend that if you are having issues because of all of the tax law changes, because of the Secure Act, and you just be diligent. Be diligent. Don't give up. File an extension if you need to.
And I don't know if it's much help, but, Social Security numbers are a federal issue. So members of Congress, constituent services may be able to help if you're delays. They may not be able to, but, that could be another route to try and help move things along if they're stuck.
Yes.
That's a very good suggestion, and one that people might not think about, because at some point timing is going to become of the essence. Okay.
I've had clients get a hold of their congressman for that reason to help facilitate.
Yeah, that's such a good point. All right. We are seeing an increase, thank goodness, of employee adoption benefits. This is something that I know the Dave Thomas Foundation has been advocating for, and many of the adoption advocacy groups. So we're seeing an increase. We are seeing more employers provide adoption benefits. So this is to you, Josh, how does the adoption tax credit work in relation to the employee adoption benefits?
So the employer benefits basically, and Becky, you probably have to tighten some things up because I rarely get these questions, but it is an exclusion. So that is income that a family gets. It's going to show up on your W-2 if they pay you a benefit, and you need to exclude that from your income. In terms of its interaction, and it is on the same form, the 8839, it's the Part 3, and it is the interaction with the adoption tax credit is when calculating qualified adoption expenses. So if I adopted in 2022 and my employer paid me, gave me $5,000 for adoption expenses, I exclude $5,000 of my income, and then I still need to come up based on expenses that I paid, and I still need to come up with another $14,890 in expenses to claim the full amount of the adoption credit. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at in that example, I'm looking at $19,980 in expenses that I need to justify. If it's special needs, which is you get that adoption assistance that provides one of those 3 things, a monthly stipend, the Medicaid, or the reimbursement non-recurring, and your employer has a IRS certified or whatever, there's IRS, it meets the IRS requirements the Congress set for an employer benefit. If they have a benefit, whether you get money from it or not, if it's considered special needs, you can take an exclusion for the full amount also.
Okay.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful. I really do. I mean, number one, who doesn't want to exclude $14,890 from your taxable income? Just saying.
Yeah.
But the jewel of that is you can claim the full amount of the credit, and you can claim the full amount of the exclusion on private or international. It just can't be for the same expenses. Yeah. And for the special needs for foster care, you can claim the credit for the $14,890 and exclude income from $14,890. And I always tell clients, especially if you are in the process of the adoption, go to your HR department. It's not going to hurt to ask them. It's not hard. It's really, really not. Even like Josh said, even if the employer doesn't give you anything, you can still, as long as they have a qualified adoption benefit program, you can exclude that income, and it's not much paperwork. The biggest caveat of it is they have to offer that to all of their employees. And Dave Thomas Foundation has a great employer toolkit.
They do.
On their website. It's top notch. And so I tell clients, just print that off, take that to your employer, and just say, hey, can we do this, get this going by the end of the year? Because I know, my adoption's going to be final next year. So this is a great employee benefit that doesn't cost the employer anything. There are a lot of large employers that do offer either reimbursement or grants or, all things, but they don't have to in order to get the income exclusion. It doesn't cost the employer anything. All they have to, the only requirement is they have to offer it to all employees. It's, box 12 code T on your W-2. That's it. And that's quite a bit of money, especially when, families are crunching numbers and pinching pennies because of, inflation's high, and every little bit helps, and I don't know, are we going to address Q-Boat here or?
Yeah, let's start right
Okay.
now. First, explain what it is, and then, yes.
Okay. As I said earlier, one of the things that, since the adoption tax credit is non-refundable, it does not cover the 10% penalty for retirement early distribution. But because of the Secure Act, QBOD is the acronym for it. It's Qualified Birth or Adoption Distribution. And qualified birth or adoption distribution from any eligible retirement plan, you can take up to $5,000 out of that retirement plan without the 10% penalty if you're under 59 and a half. Now that QBOD is per individual, not family, for each birth or adoption. So let's say my husband and I, are adopting and we need, a little boost to finish those expenses off. And so I could take $5,000 out of my qualified retirement plan. He could take $5,000 out of his qualified retirement plan. So that's $10,000 that we could take out of our retirement plan without the 10% penalty if we're under 59 and a half. Now you're going to have to pay the tax on it. But if you qualify for the adoption tax credit, that adoption tax credit will help cover the tax on that retirement distribution. So QBOD is one of the really good perks of the Secure Act.
Okay. All right. Anything to add to that, Josh?
Nope.
Absolutely no. All right. Josh, let's talk about if you're adopting, are you eligible for the child tax credit, and how does the timing work for you as an adoptive parent?
You're definitely eligible for the child tax credit if you meet the 5 criteria, which pretty much all adoptions, unless you're adopting a teenager, should qualify for. It's a relationship test, age, residency, support, and joint test. And it shouldn't be a problem for the people you're talking to. So the amount of the credit this year is $2,000, which is what it had been since 2018, except for the little bump last year. And I think the biggest issue is what Becky was talking about before with the Secure Act is getting that Social Security number especially for the infant adoptions, or possibly for the international adoptions too. But the interaction is, depending on how much earned income the family has, that $2,000 amount, $600 of it might stay and go against the tax liability before the adoption tax credit, with the other $1,400, potentially up to $1,400 of it becoming a refundable, counting as a payment. It's a little complicated. The forms take care of it. The software takes care of it. Anybody doing their own taxes, don't worry about all the math. The software will do it just fine. But they do interact a little bit. It does reduce typically how much adoption credit you can use in a year because some of the child tax credit still goes first.
Okay.
The only correction that I would like to make is the total amount has reverted back to the 2020. 500 of it is non-refundable and 1,500 of it is refundable. That's
Oh.
the only difference.
It's not 600 and 1,400?
No,
Oh, because that's what it used to be.
right, but it's not this year.
Oh,
It is
oh,
going
thank you.
to it's 500 and 1,500.
1,500.
So
Thank you.
yeah. And like just like Josh said, how much of, since it was enhanced last year, it was either 3,000 or 3,600 depending on the child's age, and it was fully refundable. It is not fully refundable this year. The total has reverted back to 2,000, and 500 of it is non-refundable. You may use it or you may lose it just depending on your tax situation, but the 1,500 of it is refundable.
Becky, as long as you're talking about that, how does the advanced tax payments work? So talk to us about how advanced tax payments would work with the adoption tax credit.
Well, thankfully, I shouldn't say thankfully, that it's no longer an issue for 2022.
Okay.
Those advanced child tax credit payments were for last year, for 2021. There were a lot of people who received part of the child tax credit in advance last year.
Oh, okay.
And then the rest that they qualified for, they received on their tax return. And this year, that is not the case. There is no advanced child tax credit payments for 2022. So it will strictly be reconciled. All of it will be reconciled on your tax return.
Okay, excellent. I want to introduce you guys to a new partner who has joined us in supporting this podcast. It is Solace Adopt. After hearing countless stories of women reporting feeling unseen or forgotten after placing their child for adoption, the team at Solace began carefully curating local made items from small businesses to fit gift boxes specifically for birth moms. The boxes now come in 3 adoption-sensitive themes and are the perfect gift for birth moms on holidays, birthdays, major life events, or simply just to say, I'm thinking about you. To get one of these Solace gift boxes, you can visit their website, adoptsolace.com, and that's ADOPTSOLACE.com. So Josh, let's talk practicalities. What type of documentation of the expenses for the adoption tax credit should you submit with your taxes? And then conversely, what should you submit and what should you keep for your own records and that type of stuff?
For submit, it's like that phrase in a song, absolutely nothing. Do not send in documentation to the IRS. There was only 3 years that needed to happen. Those were tax years 2010, 11, and 12. Do not submit. Actually, 2012, you didn't submit documentation, you just had a paper file. So 2010 and 11 are the only ones with documentation. But what folks should keep, we'll just go through them real quick. From adoptions from foster care, if you don't have expenses, there are sometimes you have expenses, adoption subsidy agreement, court decree or judgment of adoption order or whatever, the things from the court showing that you legally adopted. For private domestic adoptions that are not considered special needs, there are a couple that can be special needs. You're going to do the court decree showing that you legally adopted the child, and then the expenses. The IRS was asking back when it was refundable for not only like receipts, but also proof of payment. Because like in theory, I could just I work for NACAC on letterhead. I could create an invoice for things that you never sent me. So they wanted proof that people not only were billed this, but paid that. So generally, as Becky was saying earlier, look at the big things, focus on those. But, any paperwork showing that you owe this money, and if you've got bank statements showing that you paid them this money, I would keep those. And then for international adoptions, same thing for expenses. And for the documentation, there's a couple, and Becky might know this off the top of her head. I don't remember them. I think there's a couple of visas that work, but the golden one that works everywhere, no matter Hague or non-Hague country, is a translated document of the adoption in the foreign country. So if you've got a translated copy of, like, you adopted in China, that court decree, that thing that happened in China saying that you adopted that child, translated into English, that would work.
Yes.
Okay, so just keep a file, manila envelope, whatever you got, with all of this information, date it and save it, because if you're audited, you will need it. Is that the gist?
Becky, go ahead.
Yes, it is. And Josh said something very important that I want to reiterate. The IRS is not interested in what you were billed. They are interested in what you paid. And, of course, it doesn't happen near as much as it used to, but occasionally the IRS does request more documentation. So I tell everyone, don't panic. That's why you keep everything in that manila envelope marked IRS documentation. Show it's the documentation was the big issue back in 10 and 11. The first thing I tell clients is, number one, don't ever send originals. Send very good copies. Make sure you put whoever is first on the tax return, put their social security number in red Sharpie at the top of every page when you send it to the IRS, because sometimes tax returns go one direction, documentation goes another direction. And so you want to keep your original copies of your signed and dated home study, your signed final judgment adoption, the original copy of all of your, whether it's credit card statements, bank statements, copies of checks. You want to keep the originals of those, because, you will want to send good copies of those in if they request more documentation. And of course, always start with the big stuff.
All right, and this is I'm asking a question that goes back to something we've talked about before, and that's, we've talked about delays in getting the child's social security number, and we talked about it in relation to the Secure Act. Now, my question is there ever a time that you should consider using an adoption taxpayer identification number, an A10, or an individual taxpayer identification number, I-10? Josh, if you want to kick this one to Becky.
Becky.
Yeah, Becky. Okay, Becky. This is why you get paid the big bucks here.
It's like Family Feud, pass or play. Pass.
All right, Becky.
Well, here's with the social security numbers and the A10s. Sometimes, yes, an A10, is necessary. There are some limits to what you can use the A10 for. Number one, you cannot claim child tax credit with an A10. You can only claim the $500 other dependent credit, which is non-refundable, the $500 non-refundable, and the adoption tax credit. And so,
Wait, I thought you just said you couldn't use the A10 for the adoption tax credit. Did I misunderstand? You can. I misunderstood you. Sorry.
You can use the A10 for the other dependent credit and for the adoption tax credit. Okay. But as far as the child tax credit, you need social security number. For dependent care credit, you need social security number. And so that's why I, advise clients, if at all possible, to wait and file that extension, get that social security number, because you're automatically losing $1,500 right off the top. Right off the top, you're losing $1,500 of child tax credit. And especially last year when it was, $3,600, it's a big deal.
And last year it was also that $1,400 recovery rebate credit too. So,
and with the stimulus recovery rebate credits, some of those things, they kept changing in the middle of the game.
Yeah.
And so by all means, and sometimes what happens is when families get home, they have that final judgment of adoption. They get home and kind of settle into life and, trying to find their new normal. there's one step they've got to finish. They've got to get that Social Security number or new Social Security card, either changed name or changed name and Social Security number, depending on the age of the child, will determine if the Social Security office will let you change the number. But particularly certain situations, I highly recommend that if you can get the number changed as well, because maybe several people have had that number and have used that number, and that, creates a whole nother mess when it comes to filing your taxes. But as far as the A10 goes, it limits what you can use it for. And so if you can wait and, just as soon as the adoption is final, go get that new Social Security card.
Got it.
So I do want to point out two things related to Social Security in the filing. If you haven't been matched or a child hasn't been born and you're doing private domestic, if it will let you e-file without a Social Security number, you do that. If not, you have to paper file, write C attached, and put information about your attorney or your agency you're working with, because you might not have an actual living being to get a number for, but you're still eligible when you're in process for private domestic. The other one that I want to highlight, because we get this, and Becky made me think of this, if you're sometimes, I deal with a lot of kids adopted from the foster care system, and folks want to change that Social Security number, but they are not able to because things are really slow, or even change the name. For the purposes of taxes, you need to go, even if the courts recognize the child's name has changed, you need to go with what the Social Security Administration has on that. And then so let's say I adopt today. I'm filing my taxes. Kid's got a new name. I have a Social Security number. I have the old name, but that's what's in the Social Security Administration system. That's what the IRS sees. I'm going to use that old name, the old number, claim the adoption tax credit next year, sometime in the in between the next year filing. I have carry forward because I work in child welfare, and the number has changed, or the name has changed, or both have changed. I use the new number, and Social Security or the IRS can access the records and see what the changes happened. So you use what you got. You don't. You could wait for an existing one for the change, but with as slow as things are, I would just say file as it is, and then the next year with whatever the Social Security Administration has in their system for the child. And that's not a problem. I've talked with people at the IRS, and that's the advice they gave me, because we were getting calls
Absolutely.
like this all the time.
And that's exactly what I recommend to my clients. If they have an existing Social Security number with the old name, go ahead and use whatever, like he said, whatever the Social Security has, that is what has to go on your tax return. And then once you get your refund, then you can get the change process started.
Okay, and last question. This one's going back to you, Becky. It is not necessary to hire a tax specialist if you're trying to claim the adoption tax credit. However, there are people who want to, in particular if there's complexity or whatever, and they would feel more comfortable knowing they're going to get it. How do you find a tax specialist that's knowledgeable on the adoption tax credit? Because we get questions all the time where people are being given incorrect advice. And we recommend, in fact, I will tell you that I know that people have used this interview, as giving it to their tax preparer to help them get up to speed. So how do you determine if your tax specialist knows anything?
Well, the first thing I recommend is, number one, ask a lot of questions. And don't ever be afraid to, because you're talking about a $14,890 potential credit and exclusion. And if that person says, well, I really don't know anything, the first place you need to start is with the IRS Directory of Licensed Preparers, because there are a lot of people that do taxes that are not legal to do taxes. So I would first, that's the first place I would recommend you start. And then don't ever be afraid to ask questions. I have a lot of, I'm an enrolled agent, which is the highest credentials you can get with the IRS. And I have enrolled agents, I have CPAs, I have other tax preparers call me, because their client is sitting across the desk from them, and they're just not knowledgeable, on the situation. So, don't ever be afraid to ask questions. And a lot of the issues, it's not inputting the name and the social security number and all of those things, but the issue is 90% of the time dealing with the IRS and intricate details, because everybody's situation is different. Some situations are very simple, very cut and dry, and some of them are very complicated, takes several years and a lot of time with the IRS to get straightened out. But the first place to start is go on the IRS directory, find a legal preparer, and then start asking questions.
And I will say, in fairness to tax preparers, there's like 60 to 100,000 of these filed a year. That's a small drop in the bucket, because there's probably like 100 million returns filed a year. So if they don't know, for me, it's like, how much are they willing to ask questions? I've dealt with some trying to help families where they act like they know everything, and how dare you, non-credentialed person, dare tell me things. And I've also had people, it's like, do you read the instructions? It's like, I'm like, because it's only 8 pages. Why don't you read instructions?
Yeah.
And the last thing I would say is that you're not limited to a tax preparer that is geographically in your state, or
Correct.
so the U.S. is your oyster. You have the entire U.S. of which to choose. So if you're choosing and you're claiming it this year, choose somebody who does this and is knowledgeable. And it's a good point that Josh just said, that we shouldn't be condescending, because there's so much tax preparers do need to know, but not everybody is specializing in the adoption tax credit. Well, thank you so much, Becky Wilmoth with Bill's Tax Service and Josh Kroll with the North American Council on Adoptable Children, which goes by NACAC. You've heard him mention that. So thank you both so much for being with us today. I truly appreciate it.